feel like we need some elevator or background music.
Or something a little bit.
Feel free to provide some, Tony, if you want to break into song.
No, man. I don't even really like listening to the sound my own voice talk, let alone sing.
It is a voice session after all.
It is a voice session. Who's got the best voice of them all?
Ralph.
Ralph, yes.
I doubt that.
No, I think you win.
Yes.
All right. Hey, everyone joining in, welcome. Thanks for joining this session. I think we'll wait just, maybe a couple, 1 or 2 more minutes and let other folks trickle in. In the meantime, just sit tight, grab a cup of coffee or whatever drink is appropriate for whatever time zone you're joining from, and we'll get rolling in just a sec. All right. Rose, where are you calling in from today?
I am in New York City in the
New York
Scholastic
City.
offices in Soho.
All right, and Kylie?
I am in beautiful sunny San Diego.
Oh,
She
nice.
always says that, by the way.
After living in Finland, I feel like now that I'm living in San Diego, I have to preface it with beautiful sunny San Diego.
And Martin, what about you?
I am in beautiful, dry Dublin in Ireland.
Okay. And Ralph?
Actually, I just arrived back in Baltimore and managed to head through San Diego. And Kylie, I've got to tell you, Yoli Flores has become a fan of yours. She says, "Oh, I was on a panel with her recently. She's great." She sent me a long text telling me how lucky I was that we were going to be in the same panel together. So you've got a high bar.
All right. I like high bars. All right, I think we can get started. We're about 5 minutes in, and I think the attendees, as they trickle in, they'll just jump right in as we start. So, yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Tony Wan, and I am the head of investor content at Reach Capital, and it's a pleasure to be here to facilitate this conversation around how voice tech can help kids learn to read, or the question mark is, can voice tech help kids learn to read? Just a little bit about myself. I recently joined Reach Capital as head of investor content. We are an early stage investment firm focused on education and the future of work, and have invested in about 100 companies to date, spanning early childhood through K-12 higher education and adult and workforce development. Prior to this, I spent nearly a decade at EdSurge, where I was the managing editor and I was reporting on business trends in the EdTech industry. And this is a topic that's kind of pertinent to me and, into what I used to cover. One of my closest sources, who is now a friend, would, always playfully open every conversation with the question. So, hey, so Tony, can the kids read yet? It's become somewhat of an annoying but endearing jab, and also kind of a sobering reminder that in spite of a lot of the technological innovations and also investment capital that's been poured into this sector over the past decade, the reality remains that the needle hasn't really moved much on literacy. Even before the pandemic, results from assessments like NAEP or PISA suggest that reading fluency has more or less been stagnant, for most of this century. And recently, a New York Times article from about a week ago highlighted how the pandemic has only worsened the reading crisis and widened the gap between high performers and low performers. So as we, fingers crossed, turn the corner around the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about, not returning to normal. Normal wasn't working before, and the reality is that the reading crisis is even worse and is even more urgent than ever. So I'm excited to be here today to explore how voice technology can help with some of the most dedicated people working in this space. I want to thank Whiteboard Advisors for organizing this. Last year, they published a paper called Can Speech Recognition Help Children Learn to Read? That touches on some of the questions we'll dive into today. So I'd like to get started and I'd like to kick off with briefly introducing our wonderful panelists and hear a little bit about their current work in this space. So I'll just go in order of folks who appear on my screen. I'd like to start off with Rose. Rose Mitchell is the President of Education Solutions at Scholastic. Rose, tell us a little bit about kind of your work in voice tech and what's the one thing that excites you the most about voice tech today?
Hi, Tony, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So I think everyone knows Scholastic, but our job, as we see it, is to make sure that children learn to read and ideally, love to read. But we've got a long way to go post-pandemic. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of what the real value of voice in reading and voice tech in the classroom can be. But I think the thing I'm most excited about is developing accountability and fluency. And I think that's accountability is one of those words. With a big A, we feel worried about it. If we're talking about tests and teachers, but I mean the accountability for just doing the reading. We just know that over the last 2 years, there's so many minutes and hours of reading that didn't happen. So it's a pretty basic starting point, but practice is a lot of what needs to happen early on in reading.
Great, thank you, Rose. Next up on my screen, I see Kylie. Kylie Burke is an early childhood expert and author. And so Kylie, similarly, tell us a little bit more about your work and also what excites you the most about voice tech in relation to what you're focusing on these days.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been working in the early childhood field my whole career, spent over a decade at Teaching Strategies, which is an early childhood company. Was the CEO and spent time as the chief product officer there. Most recently was the founder of Noni Educational Solutions, focusing on supporting teachers working with trauma impacted children. And right now, that is the majority of our population in schools. And so from both an early childhood perspective and through the lens of working with trauma impacted children and families, it doesn't necessarily seem like there's this great intersection with voice technology, but really there is. So in one way, the ability for voice technology to save teachers that instructional time that otherwise would fall on the burden of the adult in their interaction with children. I would like the adults to have more time to work on relationship building with children and support children's social, emotional, and mental health and wellness needs to be able to help children regulate. And so that in so much that voice technology can help to free up some of that time for teachers, I think that is actually very, very powerful. The other piece in early childhood is we're seeing advancements in technology where voice tech is understanding younger and younger children. That has not historically been the case. Voice technology has been geared towards adults. The big companies have focused their research efforts on understanding the speech of adults. Children speak very differently. Their speech patterns are different. The way their voices sound are different. And especially when you're getting to children in the early childhood years, having accurate technology, it just wasn't out there until now. And so it's a really exciting time for voice technology to span the whole of the educational system.
Great. And next up, we have Ralph Smith. Ralph is the managing director of the campaign for grade level reading. So similarly, Ralph, tell us a little bit more about your work and what's the most exciting thing happening in voice tech from your point of view.
Well, as a person who runs the campaign for grade level reading, it will seem a little strange, but I try not to start with grade level reading, and we have migrated and intentionally so the language to early school success. because what we noticed is that a part of the challenge was that reading itself was being isolated. And there were camps that, in addition to the reading wars, there were the reading people over here and the numeracy folks over here and the social emotional learning folks someplace else. And there was a competition for time attention. So we migrated the language to early school success. And knowing that success builds on success, we say that if we can help kids experience early school success, that success will probably carry them through the later grades and will predict high school graduation. And we acknowledge that within early school success, reading itself is a gateway skill. So we don't deny that. And in fact, we organize around the gateway skill, but the gateway skill as part of a larger package. I suspect that in answer to your question, I would say that we felt as if we were on the front lines, in the sense that we had about 100 communities, which over the past 8 years seem to be making progress in terms of closing the reading gap. And we thought that by the end of the 2020 school year, we would be able to report that the progress was slow, it was small, it was frail, it was jagged, but it was progress nonetheless. The pandemic came along and eviscerated that progress in virtually every community that we were involved in. So we now have significantly more children stranded on the wrong side of a dramatically increased set of gaps. And what we know is that it was difficult to get real progress in pre-pandemic times, given the scale of the problem then. If we're going to do anything about the gaps now, after the pandemic, we're going to have to do things that are significantly different, significantly more, and significantly better. And it feels as if, as we look for those things that are more different and better, that technology, EdTech, we've got to see EdTech as providing at least a piece of the answer, and maybe a very large piece of the answer. And so, looking at the range of EdTech, certainly voice technology has a potential role to play, and we're excited about learning more about that, being in conversation and being able to point out both the risk and the opportunities as we see them.
Thank you, Ralph. And last and certainly not least, we have Martin Farrel. He is the CEO of Soapbox Labs. And I suspect, Martin, that you're working on a lot of the things that can help, maybe get at or help teachers tackle, a lot of the issues that Ralph raised. So yeah, Martin, tell us a little bit about Soapbox and, from your point of view, kind of, obviously you're kind of deep in this space, but maybe what are some of the most exciting applications of voice tech in education that you're seeing today?
Oh, thank you, Tony. Yeah, as you say, Soapbox Labs is a voice technology business. We're probably unique, I think, in the singular focus that we have on the thoughtful application of this amazing AI technology for the benefit of children. voice tech is a technology that's been around for quite a while, and it's certainly, in our belief, a utility that children should be able to benefit from, but it needs to be designed with them in mind. So, I think it was somebody earlier on who said, children are not small adults, right? They have their own specific needs and requirements, and that's no more true than in education. And in the application of this technology into education. I think that the exciting thing for me in particular, and for us as a business, is that we're only just at the beginning of exploring the potential of this technology in education, and in particular, the thoughtful application of this technology in education. There are lots of things that we are currently doing and exploring, from helping to diagnose reading challenges with pre-literate children around challenges like dyslexia, right up to automating kind of oral reading fluency and comprehension assessments and everything in between. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation today.
Awesome, Eric. Before we dive into kind of the meat of the conversation around technology, I do want to maybe level set a little bit and say, there's, when we talk about the importance of not going back to normal, like, what was the primary thing that just wasn't quite working, before, when it came to reading instruction, and how that was exacerbated during the pandemic in remote, hybrid, or home learning environments?
How long do
Wants
we
to kick
have
off?
to talk about that?
Well,
I
one
mentioned
thing, the biggest thing here.
All right. Well, I mentioned practice earlier, which is, a former colleague of mine, talks about miles on the tongue, which is about both the talking and listening and reading that young children need to do to become literate. So, I mean, just the practice in reading is essential. But reading instruction, which needs to be based on the way children learn to read. And understanding sound spellings, how those sound spellings are put together into words, and how those words are put together into sentences, I think has, I thought when I moved to the United States in 2000 that this had been solved with the National Reading Panel, but there seems to be still some fairly significant gaps in how we teach reading in the early years. And that is something that was, let's say, uneven. And there's greater disparity in that than in many things. And I think this is a place where, as Martin mentioned earlier, there's some very interesting applications of voice tech that can be happening to really understand, even at the phoneme level, what's going on, and what sounds and spellings kids are having challenges mastering and practicing, and being able to fluently blend. So, and in a developmentally appropriate way, which is not something, as Kylie said, that we had, 5-10 years ago. So I think the science-based reading instruction is I think a pretty big gap that we need to be stepping into.
Yeah, and I would also add to that two other things. One is what Ralph mentioned, was this isolation of literacy learning, of learning to read from everything else about the child. And we all know, all of us work in education, we all know that that's not true. We all know, teachers know, that you can't isolate a discrete skill set away from all other aspects of the child and child development. And particularly, again, my perspective comes from the early childhood years, that being able to attend, to regulate, to be able to access their prefrontal cortex so that they can learn something new. Those things all need to be happening in order to have effective literacy instruction. And I think in the past, we were so focused on the literacy instruction piece that we were forgetting about the rest of the child and their needs to be an effective, capable learner in our classrooms. The other thing is, I would say, it's a little bit outside of the instruction itself, but it was the pace of EdTech development. It felt like pre-pandemic things were very slow, and a company might take years to develop something and methodically plan for it and do multiple rounds of market research and tons of focus groups and try to decide what to build. And then we had the pandemic and people built stuff like that. Like solutions were just flying, and we're testing things and seeing if it works and putting something else in and seeing if it works and letting teachers give feedback in real time as they're using it. And that to me is like the most exciting thing that came out of this. And now that, you know, we have this ability to quickly create and design solutions around voice technology, I'd like to see that pace of development continue and not go back to the way it was pre-pandemic.
Got it. Wonderful.
I just jump in.
Yeah,
can I just make one comment? One comment I just wanted to make around literacy instruction is, you know, so much of it is observational, and so much of it is dependent on observation from an educator, an intervention by that educator based on that observation, and often in a very time constrained kind of world that they operate in. So, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do is to release back some of that time by using the technology to help the aspects of that literacy instruction that don't necessarily require observation. So whether that's administration of an assessment or whether it's feedback around reading practice, as Rose says, you know, if a child is practicing reading at home and somehow you can capture that in a feedback loop and capture that expressive voice of the child and feed that back to a teacher in a consumable way in a dashboard, that can really help in terms of accelerating that process and making the contact time so much more useful.
As Kylie and Martin have pointed out, I mean, like voice and speech recognition technology is not necessarily like a new, not necessarily like a new like innovation and development. It's been around for years. As we maybe transition to, can we transition to talking a little bit about technology improvements that's been made since, and like, why is this like the moment for voice tech in education and not a decade ago? Can you just share a little bit about some of the improvements or limitations, challenges that have been kind of overcome?
I can talk a bit about it from a technology point of view, but I'll just restrict myself to that part of it. I mean, I think there is obviously the accuracy piece is a big part, right? So, you know, it needs to be accurate, and educators and parents and students need to feel confident that the technology they're using actually works, that it's valid and it's reliable. That's the big improvement that we've seen in the last 10 years. I think I'll just stop there and let Ralph come in, because that for me is the game changer, is the accuracy piece. There are others, but that's the big one.
I probably know the least about technology, at least in this group, but I did have an opportunity 20 years ago to serve on the board of Leapfrog. And my colleagues on the board and that whole team would be amazed to be part of this conversation today. In fact, they're probably sitting around saying, I told you so, from 20 and 15 years ago. I do think that there are 3 points I want to make with respect to that. And the first is Kylie's point that this challenge now is perhaps a little different because of the pandemic. We have more educators willing and feeling the need to take bigger risk and understanding they've got to do something different. For many of those educators and their teachers, they have really learned during the pandemic that there are better things they can do with their time. And one of the untold stories, and one of the stories that will soon be lost, is the improvement in the relationship between teachers and parents. They're wonderful stories where teachers have found out what they may have only suspected, that they can work in real partnership with parents and investing in the relationship. We've had teachers say, you know, I never really got that part of my role was being educator coach for the parents. I never really got that, and now I understand that. And in addition to parents feeling warm about teachers who were delivering food even before they got the laptops and hotspots, who were making porch visits and lawn visits, who were available by text almost 24/7, which is really what buoyed parents. Many teachers experience enormous success because of that relationship. And really understand, and I think Becky Pringle put it right, what we've got to reinvent is the teacher day. We've got to be able to create more time in our day to build the relationship with parents and to show up in the lives of our students and to show up in that community. We can't do that, and this is Becky. We can't do that and do everything we're doing now. So we have got to create more room and space for technology than we have. And the third reason here is that even the publishing companies, and again, having confessed I sat on the board of Leapfrog for a whole lot of years, and I'm looking at Rose and with a half smile. 20 years ago, the publishing companies were death on technology. Those book publishing companies had those procurement processes within school district locked down. And the fact of the matter is technology could not get in. And trust me, we tried. We could not get by the book publishers. And book publishers over the last decade especially have evolved enormously. The market has changed. And they are now, most of them, just for their own survival, are in technology as well. And that creates an opportunity that really wasn't there 20 years ago. The challenge of the current opportunity is we have a range of products now on the market and a significant variation in quality. And we have a surplus of dollars and very little discerning capacity on the part of the folks who are making those decisions. So it is highly likely that a lot of decisions now being made are going to be made and regretted, and that the backlash from the buyer's remorse will reinforce a pre-existing suspicion of technology. So I think that whether it's whiteboard advisors or Rich Capital or everybody, there's a real need to figure out how to get quality assurance into the marketplace and how to support building capacity to make smart decisions. And a part of that is going to have to be the sense making. Because of the structure of the market, we talk about different pieces of technology, but we are not doing enough to help parents and teachers and superintendents who are making the decisions to really step back and see the landscape of technology and realize that there's no single technology, that is probably a mix. And because of the privatization of the market and the specialization of the market, we are now at a point where there's probably going to be overload. There is overload. There is confusion. There are competing and contrasting claims. There's a high likelihood of bad decisions. And we're essentially creating the potential for a super backlash. So whenever I'm in these panels, I keep asking folks, what are we doing to improve quality, to improve sense making, to improve the likelihood of smart decisions, and to protect against backlash? Because if we're not doing that, we run the risk that in this post-pandemic era, we go right back to where we were.
Yeah, I just want to jump on, Ralph, I'm so glad you said that. I'm involved with the EdTech Evidence Exchange, which is really focused on looking at what it takes to implement something effectively. Not everything can be implemented in every context in the same way with the same results. And I think there's a real value in the industry working together to ensure that that backlash is buttressed by and met by both effective implementation models as well as efficacy. And I think, you know, something like voices and voice-powered tech is a great method in which to collect that, as long as it's concatenated with other more distal measures. So I'm on board with that. So we should follow up afterwards. I think that's really important.
We should.
One thing I'd just like to add is Kylie's talked about kids and the trauma aspects, which are, you know, as a very SEL minded publisher, if you will, Ralph, you know, is, you know, right at the core of Scholastic's mission. I mean, the other thing I'd say is that with so much to this moment, the kids have had so much screen time, and I know we're all tired of hearing that. And as a parent, I'm tired of saying it, but, and not all screen time is created equal, et cetera, et cetera. But there is an impatience and an intolerance even for readers in the act of reading. And we see this in classrooms all the time, is that now that kids are back, and developing just even the discipline of reading and making sure there's some feedback loops for kids is becoming more and more important. So even without the assessment and the reading instruction, if you watch kids, as I have in testing with voice recognition and speech recognition, and you see how a voice talking back, whether that's a coach, a reading coach kind of companion, or just somebody, you know, a voice following up on comprehension afterwards, acknowledging that you did it, whether it's connected to gamification, that motivation can pull kids through. When we looked at this for Read 180 8 years ago, the technology wasn't there, but I was saying to someone, almost every kid is like a Read 180 kid now. You have to find ways to pull them through the text. We're all readers, and I'm sure we all think it's valuable and the gateway skill, but even kids that can read don't always want to read. And so we're going to have to bring many of them back.
Yeah, and I think there's also a growth from that can happen for the adult in the child's life. So if the technology has the ability to recognize children's speech so accurately and then respond appropriately in a way that technology can actually become a coach for the adult, a very passive coach. But as you know, think about a parent doing the dishes. Here's the way that the technology responds, the way the technology asks a question back, the kinds of encouraging words that it can use. So when we think about, you know, some of the risks here or what to watch out for, we want to make sure that those interactions really model what best practice kinds of interactions would look like with an adult talking to a child, because it does, I believe, it has the power to act as a coach or a model for the adults in children's lives, whether that's the teacher, in early childhood, an assistant teacher, or families at home.
We've heard a lot about, some really good ideas about the power and potential for voice technology to transform, the instructional and reading experience that you just shared around, like saving time, for instance, to focus on other things like building relationships. But I want to, maybe go one level deeper and just get at, what does it take to realize, some of these great ideas and potential that you've talked about? I think the deeper question is, are schools and teachers ready, or what does it take to take these ideas and put them into practice and implement some of these tools with fidelity? Is it a mix of training? What do we need to make sure that teachers are actually changing and improving their practices with, voice technology enabled tools?
I think you have to bring them on the journey, Tony. I think that, it is in the education space, whilst it's been around for a long time, voice is still a relatively new technology that's being used in the classroom to support different activities like literacy instruction and so on. I think that, you know, there is a very strong role for the publishers here, and it's a role that they play traditionally, which is, you know, in terms of product design, that they will include stakeholders within that design process. But I think there are aspects to this now which include things like, you know, voice UI UX, which is a relatively new field, particularly in relation to children. And how do you, for example, use metaphors within the design to encourage children to engage? And as Rose said, you know, what kind of techniques can you use that will improve engagement levels and possibly get engagement levels around reading that you wouldn't necessarily get using more traditional approaches? So I think, you know, it is about using an inclusive approach that's built on a foundation of trust, right? So it's, you know, there's a phrase that I heard the other day, which is sort of innovation happens in education at the speed of trust, right? So the innovation can happen, but we need to trust that the underpinning technology that we're using is valid and reliable. And I think that we've got to the stage now where we can do that with voice, but it's very much, for us anyway, a partnership and collaborative approach around product design that needs to take place.
I know we talk about the redesigning the Teacher's Day and the efficiency message. I have found that does not resonate that well with all teachers. You know, they're used to doing certain things, and they, like any of us who have a set of habits and behaviors, you know, those habits and behaviors were changed over the course of the day from being in a space to being on the screen. And many of them, you know, didn't really change the nature of them by going to the screen either. It's telling them it's just going to be faster and more efficient and more accurate than they are is not going to, you know, that's not going to be a way to bring them on the journey, as Martin said. So I think finding ways to understand what problem you can actually solve for them, and in partnership is pretty important. I mean, if I went to my second graders parent teacher and they told me that they didn't ever listen to my child read anymore, the machine did that, I'd be concerned, right? So what should the teacher be doing, and what should the machine be doing, and how does that work together most effectively? And I think that's key to the you know, successful use cases.
Rose, let me quickly say I agree that the hesitancy is real and possibly pervasive. And you notice that the only citation I gave was to Becky Pringle, head of the NEA. So that there's a teacher out there sitting down there. Here he goes again. Somebody else wants to restructure our day. It's I threw Becky right under the bus on that one. Say that the head of the NEA is now saying we've got to think differently about this, because I don't think that she speaks necessarily for the majority of teachers. I think it's going, as you say, it's going to take a while to bring the profession along so that their skepticism, and this skepticism is deeply and long held, reinforced by a number of things, that skepticism is overcome, and the bar to overcome it is pretty high. But we're at a point in time where the situation is sufficiently dire, and I think most teachers are sufficiently concerned that we have an opportunity for a dialogue that was not there 3 years ago. And it's maybe a narrow window, but it's a window we really have to take.
Yeah, we were having this conversation last week at the South by Southwest EDU conference. And one of the things that I think is really critical to this is that the people in EdTech companies who are doing this development work that the people on those teams, the people within the management team of these companies, that they reflect the lived experiences of these communities that they're serving. And I think that when that is the case, you end up with solutions that have a much better product market fit, that resonate with teachers, that bring teachers along. But that is so critical, that we can't, as EdTech companies, have teams of folks who are disconnected from the classrooms and communities that we're serving. We have to be deeply connected, especially now, and especially when you're talking about introducing new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, that skepticism and backlash you all alluded to, it's, certainly not unfounded, right? I think the industry has had, sometimes a spotty history of kind of servicing products that may not have been able to live up to their potential, and just and kind of led to some disappointment. Martin, at the beginning, I think of this conversation, you said that we are kind of still at the beginning of exploring thoughtfully, how to apply voice technology to build, powerful education tools. And I want to hear from your experience, as you work with publishers and other companies to bring voice-enabled apps to life. Like, what does it take to, on the vendor side, to thoughtfully design, quality tools, so that the market now or 5 years from now is has as many good quality products as much as possible?
Yeah, I think, Tony, there's probably two different ways to tackle that particular question. The first one is, and often the most obvious way to do it, is to say, well, how do we automate how we currently do things, right? So how do we take something that we currently have in market, use the technology to automate it for whatever reason, generally speaking, to save time or cost, and how do we bring that similar product to market, but with some shiny technology now embedded within it. The second way of looking at that is to say, well, actually, how would we design this product now that we know that we have the technology available to us? How would we rethink this? And the best way, the best kind of analogy or description I can think of is in relation to testing and assessment. A lot of assessments, particularly summative assessments, were designed because there was an implicit assumption that it required a human assessor to conduct that specific task or that activity. If you didn't have to rely on that, you would probably think about designing the assessment in a different way. And again, go back to my point about removing the administrative burden from the teacher and opening up the possibility of, so you're not actually spending your day administering assessments, you're actually spending your day, as Rose said, observing and actually intervening with learners in the way that you intended to do when you entered the profession. So I think there are different ways that you can approach it. The preferred approach for us is to think, right, okay, well, how can we now rethink product design now that we know that we have these technologies available to us? And that's a really good starting point.
You're also
I think one of the
go ahead, Kylie.
I think one of the things that's different here is that voice technology is very natural for children. It's a very natural way of being. Talking is a very natural way of being. Children are much more comfortable talking to their technology, right? They ask Siri, they ask Alexa, that is how they're interacting with technology. I think back to when my daughter entered kindergarten and was put in front of a computer screen and for her kindergarten entry assessment. And the teacher said, there's going to be this question and it's read to you on headphones. And then you click on the thing that matches. And it was like a triangle, a square, a circle, click on the triangle. And she just kept tapping the screen because she had no idea what a mouse was. Like, that's unnatural technology. That was unnatural. We all had to learn what this thing was and how to use it and how to manipulate it. Voice tech is very natural for children. So even if we just think about the evolution of technology and how it's getting better and better, to not leverage this very natural experience of interacting with technology through our voices just would seem like such a missed opportunity.
The other thing is that the classroom, if you really think about what goes on in a classroom, and anyone who's shot any video in a classroom, it's often not that interesting. You know, a lot of what's going on in a classroom is oral, it's audio, right? It's the mixture of instruction and classroom management and individual and group behaviors. And, you know, there's all this great research about the number of interactions a teacher will have in a 45-minute period. I mean, you think about how fantastic it is that voice can pick up and hear each child and be able to capture that in interesting and important ways, not just for reading, but for all kinds of things. And then on the teacher side, you know, how can voice also be an assistant to them? I mean, if anyone ever needed an executive assistant, it's a teacher. And so, you know, I think that as it becomes more natural, and because the classroom is an oral space, there's huge potential, I think, for that coach for kids and a support for teachers.
And there's also simple things where it's like, you know, kids, when they hear themselves back, right? It's an amazing feedback loop for them in terms of reinforcement, right? So they ask to read something, they read it, they can listen to themselves back, and they can see how well they did, right? That's an amazing feedback loop that is really simple, but is brought to life by the implementation of this technology. So there are really simple things that can be very powerful. That, I mean, I remember the first time I heard myself, it was probably, you know, I was 10 or 11 or 12, and it was a cassette recorder. But kids these days, you know, they can listen back to themselves so easily. So that feedback loop can be so powerful.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes I feel as if I'm, you know, it's like Ebenezer Scrooge gets invited to the Christmas party. And so let me, before we get to the end, play Scrooge. And that's it. I'm assuming, and we all assume without saying so, that this is a conversation about how we close the gap, that in many respects, it means we're committed to closing the gap, because again, having sat on the leapfrog board, I can tell you that technology can increase the gap. And for a number of us who were on that board, that was a very uncomfortable feeling, knowing that we were helping the kids whose families could afford our price point. And by helping the families who could afford our price point, we were widening the gap between those kids and the kids who could not. So the assumption in these conversations is that we remain concerned about the gap. And therefore, we've got to say there's a population out there. And that population is not all white, it's not all rich or middle class. When I go through Clear Me, and unfortunately, I'm doing it much more in the last 6 months than I want to, there's probably a 2 in 10 chance now that when I do the eye facial recognition, so for the iris recognition, whatever they call that, there's a 2 in 10 chance that some good-looking Black guy is going to pop up, but it's not me. So this issue of bias in terms of facial recognition technology is very real and has had calamitous consequences for a whole lot of people. So there's a deep suspicion. So, and merely by saying voice recognition and expecting people to say, oh, that's different from facial recognition, isn't terribly realistic. That's not the first thing that's going to happen. And for communities that have been experimented on from time to time, the suspicion of bias and the reality of bias and the potential for bias is something that really is going to have to be taken on frontally. And Martin, I'm wondering, and I know this is an issue that Soapbox has worried about, paid attention to, and I wonder if you could take some time and say something about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head, to be honest, Ralph. I mean, it is something that you have to proactively plan for from the outset, right? So you cannot, I mean, and too often, I think when we're dealing with AI, not just in education, but in other areas of life, it's kind of like, well, there's a data set over there. Let's use that data set to train some models, and hopefully that will produce a product that we can all use. Well, if the data set itself has an inherent bias in it, then the product that you end up with is going to have inherent bias in it, right? So you have to think from the ground up in terms of your data design around what is it we're going to include. So we did that from the very beginning. You know, we have data from something like 192 countries in our product, so very broad coverage of accents and dialects and so on. But then we take it a step further and we actually go out and look for independent third-party authentication around that. So we work closely with the Florida Center for Reading Research, who have done some independent study and found, you know, very strong consistency with our technology in terms of assessor rating around individual items and so on, but also no bias in scoring of item level accuracy, either with white and black students, white and Latinx students, or students from high poverty or low poverty backgrounds. And these are large sample sets, right? So you have to actually take it upon yourselves. And this kind of goes back to a point you were making earlier on about validation in the market. You know, we go out and independently ourselves seek that validation and third-party authentication of what we're doing. There needs to be more visibility of that in the market, and there needs to be a more structured way of being able to, as a teacher or as a school or as a district, being able to measure the product that you're looking at buying and saying, right, okay, well, is it going to fulfill those requirements for me? Can I be certain that it is bias free, and what is the evidence to support that?
Thank you.
We're coming up towards the end of the hour, but I want to make time for audience questions. We have one from Amy Barto, who is leading, who's got the first question. And her question is: we have been working with voice tech for quite some time with students with disabilities. How are those experiences and knowledge being bridged into this current work?
It's a really good question. So, you know, in any case where you're dealing with students who may have specific needs, particularly around technology, what you need to do is to extend your models to be able to accommodate those students. So that's where you'll get to with that. So you need to bring in data that is going to be able to be able to support that specific cohort of students, depending on what the disability is. I don't know which he is referring there, but you know, I'll give you an example. You know, we are for example using the technology to help diagnose pre-literate kids with specific reading challenges that they might have later on. So this is, you know, kids who are not yet able to read. Can you identify whether or not they are at risk of developing dyslexia, for example? So there are different ways of doing it, but it's about basically adding data into the models to support that cohort of children.
And I'll just add, there are, you know, other companies who have dyslexia screeners. So if we're talking about, you know, very specific reading disabilities and reading disorders that are, you know, designed to actually screen for those kinds of challenges in young children. So the technology is out there and being tested in those ways, as Martin described. There's a great question that that came up around the sophistication around phoneme recognition, and maybe Tony, you can. It's a really good one because it's about transpositions and some of the challenges when you're doing segmentation and what have you, really at the phoneme level in young children.
Yeah, so the question is from Sarah, I missed this earlier in the chat. How accurate is speech recognition on a phoneme level for young children? My experience is that speech recognition is good in cases where the mistakes are very obvious, but not as reliable in cases where mistakes are not as obvious. And then, you know, kids have substituted short A for short O sounds, things like that. So maybe this question for Martin, like what have you seen, or what can you speak to in terms of, you know, ensuring accuracy in today's level of voice AI?
Yeah, I mean, we do obviously provide assessment down to the phoneme level with our own technology. We're very confident that it is accurate. There is a piece of this which is also around how you then design activities to support that, right? So if you're, for example, looking to do a, you know, phonological awareness type activity, you know, you would ask the child to say things, say sheep without the p, for example. So you're trying to isolate the letter sound that you want them to identify outside of that word, for example. So some of that does come down to how you design item types based around the use of the technology, rather than if you were using it without the technology. But certainly our technology is very, very strong in terms of being able to accurately identify individual phonemic sounds, whether they're isolated or contained within a short utterance or word.
And I would add that, you know, some of the linguistic models that have been designed for sounds within words, because in connected text, I can see how that could be more common. But obviously all voice tech teams are looking at, you know, the accuracy levels, but they're really getting down to the linguistic models between letters and with digraphs, so that you can actually tell whether the sound is correct in a word where there may be an A instead of an O, or the other way around. So it continues to get better, and also to be tested. We haven't talked about different accents given, you know, the demographic of our youngest children. You know, I know Soapbox and others have done work around, you know, the role of very different accents, not just the developmental and articulation needs that we need to capture in the linguistic models. So you know, I feel optimistic that's going to continue to improve.
That brings to mind the tomato distinction.
You having a go at me?
Yeah, great. Awesome. I don't think I see any other questions, but you know, I'd like to kind of wrap up with maybe like a final kind of a fill in the blank kind of question. I think we've covered, you know, a lot of you know, different elements of kind of where the technology is today as it relates to addressing the challenges in reading that we're seeing. But the title of this, you know, session was, "Can voice tech help kids learn to read?" And I think, you know, the answer is yes, but comma, but only if, you know, fill in the blank. So, you know, as final question, I would invite you all to fill in that blank. Can voice tech help kids to learn to read? Yes, but only if. Rose, you want to start?
No, I'll go last.
You want to go last? Who wants to go first? Martin.
I'll go first. I would say, but only if thoughtfully applied with teacher input.
Great. Ralph?
I would merely amend Martin's and say teacher and parent input.
Thank you, Ralph.
Kylie?
I would say yes, but as only one part of a larger solution. Because I was going to say yes, if thoughtfully applied by EdTech developers, but I feel like that's kind of been beat to death. So.
And Rose, wrap us up.
Yeah, as long as it is connected to all of the other aspects of learning to read and loving to read, because a pure technocratic approach, just because you can, because the technology exists, is never going to be a good rationale. It's got to be a benefit to children.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, and especially to our panelists, Rose, Kylie, Martin, and Ralph. Thank you so much for spending time with us to share your thoughts and insights on this really exciting and you know, hopefully, you know, emerging, not so emerging, but you know, more of a mainstream topic soon in our line of work. And of course, thank you to Whiteboard Advisors for kind of putting this together and organizing this. Yeah, at this point, I would say class dismissed. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.